So dopamine is essential for human life.
There's no turning dopamine off that we should
No
ever
turning
want.
dopamine off. And anyone who thinks they're going on a dopamine detox and really banishing their brains of dopamine, I hate to burst the bubble, but that would not be compatible with life. Um, yeah, so dopamine is really essential in what we can think of as motivation, our desire, our seeking, anything that is goal directed. And it's been described by one very famous neuroscientist by the name of Kent Berridge, who has labeled the key function of the dopamine system as wanting.
Mm.
And he's contrasted this with something that it's often confused with, which is liking. Many times we like the things we want, but not all the time. Sometimes we get caught up in a wanting cycle that is not necessarily leading to liking. But dopamine also plays an incredibly positive, important role. When I, spring out of bed in the morning and go down to have my cup of tea and have the strong, aspiration to meditate, that's inevitably relying on the dopamine system.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dharma Lab. I'm Cortland Dahl. I'm here with my dear friend, Richie, Dr. Richard Davidson, who, as I'm sure most of you know, is one of the most eminent neuroscientists on the planet. So we're incredibly fortunate to have him in discussion yet again, and for a topic which he is specifically well-suited to talk about, which is dopamine. And I never thought that would be actually a good hook for a talk like this, but dopamine has kind of taken on almost like a mythic status in popular culture. And it's one of these things that perhaps almost have become like the bad boy of the brain. Like the amygdala is a brain region that always kind of gets a bad rap and is associated with all sorts of negative things. These days, of course, we hear a lot about dopamine. You might have heard of things like a dopamine detox. And basically, it makes it sound like this is just some toxic thing in the brain that we want to get rid of or shut off or have less of in some way. So we thought we could get a little bit into the science of neurotransmitters generally, and then specifically about dopamine. What does the science really say? What function does it actually play in not only in our brains, but in our ability to thrive and to flourish? So Richie, maybe we can just start this kind of zooming way out. I'm guessing people have certainly heard the word dopamine. Some people may have geeked out a little bit and learned more and, done something like a dopamine detox. Other people may have heard about serotonin or other neurotransmitters, but my guess is people's understanding of this might be a little fuzzy. So maybe we could just start with the idea of a neurotransmitter and then we can zoom in and look at dopamine specifically. So you want to just give us a bit of a primer on what we
Sure.
should know about how this operates in the brain?
Yeah, yeah. So thank you so much. And this is a juicy topic, and very appropriate for Dharma Lab. So there are this constellation of molecules in the brain that play many different roles. One of the roles is a role that you mentioned, a neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter has a very specific role in mediating the interaction between two neurons. So when one neuron fires, it will send an electric potential down the axon of that neuron, which is you can think of it as the wire from the cell body. The cell body is where all the basic machinery is, and then there's an axon, which is the wire extending from the neuron. And those axons can be short and they can be very, very long. If I asked you now to please move the big toe in your right foot, all of you should be able to do that. That's actually a neuron that extends all the way from your brain to your big foot. That's how
That's a
you do it.
single neuron? Really?
It's a single neuron.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It is a single neuron. So the neurons have many different lengths. And at the end of the axon, there is the machinery which will release a a little packet of chemical, and that packet will bind to what's called a receptor on another neuron, and that will initiate an electric change in that second neuron. And that's how communication works between two or more neurons. And that's called a neurotransmitter. There are also neurotransmitters and other molecules that act as neuromodulators. So a neuromodulator is a different role than a neurotransmitter. And dopamine, that is the topic of our conversation today, can serve as both a neurotransmitter and as a neuromodulator. So what is the difference between a neurotransmitter and a neuromodulator? A neuromodulator will alter the threshold for the firing of a neuron. It doesn't actually, it's not actually involved in the direct cell to cell communication, but it is the molecular soup in which the neuron resides, and that will change the thresholds for the firing of that subsequent neuron. And that's what a neuromodulator is. And there are many molecules that serve as both neurotransmitters and as neuromodulators, and dopamine is one of them that serves in both capacities. So I think it's fair to say, and I think most neuroscientists would agree with me about this, that we have not yet discovered the full range of neuromodulators and neurotransmitters in the human brain. It's a vast number. You know, we've heard in the popular press about dopamine and serotonin and maybe norepinephrine and maybe GABA, but that's about it. There really is, there are hundreds of these molecules that are playing complicated roles. And this is, by the way, in general, why it's extremely hazardous to pin a particular mental state on a single molecule. That's almost assuredly excessively simplistic and wrong. So, to the best of our knowledge at this point in time, there's no well-defined psychological state that can be pinned to one specific molecule.
And
It's
Richie,
just
maybe
much,
just as a footnote too, because I think it's mind-boggling when you hear some of the reality of how complex our brains are. But could you just say a little bit about the estimates about how many neurons there are? And then beyond that, even the connections between neurons, because now we're talking about neurons communicating with each other. I mean, it's an order of magnitude like we can't even comprehend
can't
the
comprehend. So
complexity of what's happening, between our ears.
the estimated number of neurons in the human brain is about 85 or 88, somewhere around there, billion.
It's a B, everyone.
Billion. And then the estimate of the number of connections among those neurons is in the trillions. And that's beyond,
That's in your head, everyone. I mean, just trillions of interconnections and all these little communications, neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. I mean, the number of times that is happening, like right now, as you're listening, it's kind of we just can't even comprehend. Like it's beyond what we can actually even think about.
yeah, yeah, really, that's a very true statement. And I often reflect on this as a humility induction. Because it is so friggin' complicated, and we really understand so little of it at this point in time. If we pause to really appreciate the complexity, um, and if we're honest with ourselves, It really is a humility induction. And, it also exposes how gross our measures are. When we think about EEG, when we've done a lot of research with EEG, and the first paper we published with long-term meditation practitioners was with EEG, where we put electrodes on the scalp surface. We use it because it's non-invasive and it has very fast time resolution. But some people have likened this to taking a stethoscope, the kind of thing you put on your heart and listen to the sounds. Put a stethoscope on the hood of a car and try to understand how the car works by listening to the sounds from the stethoscope. That's what the EEG is like. Uh,
So by
so,
in this case, gross, you mean it's such a coarse level of
course,
analysis
yeah,
for something that is so incredibly nuanced beyond, what our minds can comprehend. So our
yes,
tool, at some point in history, we'll look back and it'll just seem like the Stone Age, like the way we're looking at the brain now, because it's just
totally,
so
totally.
complex.
And there's a whole class of research that goes on in animals, and there are some, I think, serious ethical issues about this kind of research. And that could be the subject of another Dharma Lab. We're not going to talk about that right now, but putting those ethical issues temporarily aside, uh, those studies in animals are done because they use methods that cannot be used in humans, that are invasive methods that allow scientists to look at a much more granular level of analysis that just can't be examined with the methods that we have now in humans.
That's great. So, maybe I think this was not where we were expecting to go here, but one thing actually, and this too could be another episode, is that I think when you really start learning about these things, like you might come to somebody like Richie and think, oh, you're gonna get this sophisticated knowledge. And in many ways you will. But I think actually it's the mystery of just seeing even the world's leading experts when it comes to the brain, like you, Richie, you just get the sense that actually we're just barely knocking on the door of this universe of that's so awe-inspiringly complex and nuanced. And it's kind of as much, as what you learn as just like you're looking up into the night sky and just feeling the majesty of just this incredible, and the fact that that's literally happening between our ears. It's really awe-inducing when you really kind of open up to that.
It is. And, we're constantly forming new synapses, and uh, even structural changes in the brain happen much more quickly than we ever thought they could. And, you know, we don't have one of the really interesting things about the brain is that it has no receptors for feeling itself. So, when you touch your skin, we can feel that. And if we put a vibrator on the skin, we would feel that. If you put a vibrator on the brain directly, open the brain up and put a little vibrator there, you wouldn't feel it.
Hmm, hmm,
Um, and it probably there's an evolutionary reason why, because our brains are active all the time. If we were actually feeling like tingling all the time whenever our brains were active and whenever new synapses were forming, it would really disrupt our capacity to navigate our everyday life. We wouldn't be able to sleep.
hmm.
It would just interfere with everything. And so there's probably a reason why we are protected from that. But this is like I do this kind of little practice where I just, envision all these changes occurring, and it's kind of majestic. It really is awe-inspiring. And I've looked at enough images from studies that have taken samples of brain tissue where you can look with an electron microscope at, super high resolution that we can't do non-invasively, but you can see the extraordinary complexity and beauty that we just don't have introspective access to.
So yet another topic to put a pin in for a future one is just the mystery of the brain, and even beyond that, the mystery of consciousness, which is yet another even more mysterious. But
Yes.
let's zoom back into to neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, which it sounds like, if I'm kind of picking up the key details, one way to think about it is just how neurons are talking to each other, or with modulators, how they're kind of influencing the level of activity between one another. Is that maybe just kind of to boil it
Yes.
down? So dopamine is so interesting because the headlines and it's kind of a meme worthy, aspect of the brain. Could you talk about dopamine specifically? I mean, what do we actually know about dopamine and the functions it's serving in the brain?
Yeah. So dopamine is essential for human life.
There's no turning dopamine off that we should
No
ever
turning
want.
dopamine off. And anyone who thinks they're going on a dopamine detox and really banishing their brains of dopamine, I hate to burst the bubble, but that would not be compatible with life. Um, so, uh, uh, so dopamine is really essential in uh, what we can think of as motivation. Our desire, our seeking, anything that is goal directed, where we have a plan, even if it's a pedestrian plan, like, after this podcast, we might go and have dinner. So it could be something as simple as that. There is an element of motivation that is part of that, which is involving the dopamine systems in the brain. And it's been described by one very famous neuroscientist, by the name of Kent Berridge, who is a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan, who has made seminal contributions to our understanding of the dopamine system. And he has um, labeled the key function of the dopamine system as wanting.
Mm.
And he's contrasted this with something that it's often confused with, which is liking. So many times we like the things we want, but not all the time. And particularly for those viewers of Dharma Lab, who all of you have, I think, some appreciation of how your mind works and an interest in how your mind works, I think that we all, as a group, have a little bit of insight into recognizing that sometimes we get caught up in a wanting cycle that is not necessarily leading to liking, but it's a kind of perseverative loop that we get caught in of wanting. And this is, I think in part the reason why there is the popular stereotypes about dopamine. But dopamine also plays an incredibly positive, important role. When I, spring out of bed in the morning and go down to have my cup of tea and then meditate, and have the strong, aspiration to meditate, that's inevitably relying on the dopamine system too.
Mm.
Um, if dopamine were completely blunted, it would be very difficult to get out of bed and to do anything. And so you can think of it as a kind of approach oriented, energetic stance. And so anytime we have an aspiration to do something, that's going to inevitably rely on, at least to some extent, on the dopamine system. And so this is not a system we want to get rid of.
Let me give you a real world experience, and I'd love to ask how dopamine does or does not play a role in this experience. So I am very rarely on social media, and it's not something I spend much time on. But the other night, I had this interesting experience that probably a lot of people have all the time, where somebody had forwarded a link to me, and it was it doesn't even matter the company, but it was one of these apps where you end up scrolling forever, and it was this video I'm laughing because it was like, I literally was like laughing hysterically out loud. I was just sitting by myself in a room. If somebody had like peeped in the window, they would have, thought I was nuts. But anyways, it was this video where there's some kind of filter, like when you're, on, one of these messaging apps where there was like two friends together and they're both looking at the screen of themselves. So it's like they're seeing their own picture, but the person had put on this filter, and the filter actually would have a bug crawling across your face. So if you're looking at the screen and just looking at the screen, it would look like all of a sudden there's a spider. And so the video that somebody had forwarded that I was watching was just one friend kind of as a prank showing this to somebody else and seeing how the friend reacted. And although of course there was no real bug, just seeing what looked like a spider, people would like be slapping themselves. And it was just, it was hilarious. And so I watched that and I was just like, I was literally laughing hysterically. And, the algorithms of these apps, they know that, it's like, oh, Cort watched this whole thing twice. And so then it shows you more of the thing that you clearly liked. So then there was another one, and this next one was even funnier. It was wives who were, again, playing a prank on their spouse where they would kind of pretend to freak out like there was something going on. They'd scream and like run around just to see what the husband would do. In all these videos, the husband would start screaming and running around. And it was just hilarious. I was laughing out loud. It was super funny. But then I got into this loop where I was like trying to find another one of these things. Like it was so funny and I had like a little burst of joy. And I literally then like wasted an hour of my time where after a few minutes, I wasn't laughing anymore. And I was just sort of scrolling mindlessly. I wasn't even consciously thinking like, I have to find another one of those funny videos, but I was just in this inner loop where I was just sucked into the endless scroll until I finished. And I'm like, I got to go to bed. And then I just felt like, what a waste of time. Like that first minute or two was actually really funny. And it was nice to laugh hysterically like that. And then it was just a lot of mind numbing scrolling that was utterly unsatisfying. So let's just look at a moment like that from the perspective of, what's going on in the brain and specifically with dopamine. So I think these are the moments where people kind of demonize dopamine as though like that's the thing that has happened and we need to somehow extract it. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, those are interesting kind of experiences that I think all of us have occasionally. Um, and I would say, that dopamine likely plays some role, at least in the initial entry into that scrolling perseveration. Whether it is something that is sustaining that over this period of time, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think part of it depends on the extent to which you feel a real strong urge to do it. If someone took away your phone at that point, how would you react? Uh, um, there are kind of ways of thinking about probing this, whether
Mhm.
this wanting cycle is really what is dominant. There could be other reasons why people scroll. Another one of my theories is that people engage in this kind of behavior in part to block the default mode because it is consuming. I think referring to another episode of Dharma Lab, or we've probably mentioned this several times, and I'm curious what your phenomenological report is, Cort, of when you are scrolling. But I think that at least in the initial stages of scrolling, when people are really into it, there's what we would call experiential fusion,
For sure.
um, where their whole awareness is fused with the activity that they're engaged in. There's not a lot of meta awareness, and they're just, they're sucked in.
Yeah, it's almost like
Um,
there's no conscious doom scrolling, because if you were fully aware and conscious, you would just stop doing it. Is the reality. Like
exactly.
I sometimes have the same experience drinking soda where I felt like actually you kind of have to do this mindlessly, because if you really savor the taste, it's actually kind of gross. I've noticed like there's certain foods and certain things you consume that
But
actually
that's not
only
true of
work.
French fries.
Richie, now
This is
you're
a
in sensitive
private joke.
now you're in sensitive territory, Richie. We're not going to go there. But I will seed you with soda. French fries, we'll see. I'll experiment with that. But it's true. It's like
Yeah.
there's certain things that they kind of only work mindlessly, and when you consciously do them, you would just not do them anymore because they just don't
Yeah.
feel good. They don't. It's interesting. It
Yeah. So
changes a
I
lot.
think exactly. So I think that that is in part what sustains that kind of behavior as well. And
Mhm,
that I don't think is primarily a dopaminergic process.
mhm.
Um, and viewers may ask, okay, well then what's the molecule that's responsible for that? And I would say likely 500 molecules. Um, so don't even try to think about it that way. It's not the right level of analysis.
Mhm. And so going back to Barrage's work, and actually we have a whole episode on this distinction between liking and wanting. We can maybe put that in the show notes because we actually went deeply into that. And there's a great paper, where he summarizes a lot of the research in this area. But if you look at that experience I was having, there was a moment of genuine liking. Like I was having fun. I was laughing hysterically. And then there was a moment of seeking. Like I was just looking, and there's all sorts of interesting things in the way the algorithms are working. Like there's something around the duration, and like you need to have almost like there's something of novelty. Like I've noticed if you really pay attention
Yes.
to it, it's not just everything is the same. Like it gives you, it's almost like you get things that are different intentionally, and then you get something you like and you're like, oh, it sort of feels new again. Whereas if you just got that same thing, even though you like it, if you got it 10 times in a row, it's almost as though you kind of you just sort of grow accustomed to that, and then it kind of loses the newness, the novelty factor. So there's something around duration, there's something around novelty, there's
Yeah.
certainly something
So
around
about
emotion capture.
novelty,
There's all sorts of things mixed into it.
yeah. And the novelty piece that you're mentioning, Cord, is a really important piece and is a very important aspect of dopamine function that has been studied. We haven't talked about it yet, so I'll formally introduce it. And there's this idea of a reward prediction error,
Hmm.
as it's called in the technical scientific lingo. And what is a reward prediction error? In this case, you have a certain class of video that you're looking at. You saw one, and so you have a mental model of what these videos are like.
So that's not
And
what I want. That's now in the wanting. I'm looking for
exactly, you're looking for that. And let's say the next video you encounter is even more hysterical.
that.
That's a reward prediction error, where you actually will see a larger dopamine spike than you saw previously. If you saw a video that was, say, comparable, absolutely comparable to what you just saw, there wouldn't be any change in the dopamine signal. And if you saw a video that was much less interesting, and less compelling, there would actually be a decline, a decrement in dopamine. And so dopamine signaling is very dynamic and it's responsive to the information to which you are being exposed. And it plays an important role in certain aspects of learning, and it will inform your future seeking, so to speak.
So
And so this is another role that dopamine plays.
So let's unpack that. That's interesting. So imagine I just had this image of we just had Easter holiday here in the US, and I had this image of like a little kid running around looking for the Easter egg, right? And it's exactly that. They have the model, they know what they want, and they're looking, they're not finding, and then they're finding, and sometimes they find something that maybe even is beyond, like it's whatever, an extra big piece of candy or whatever they're looking for, or they find a basket with all the candy. And it felt like a good example of that because the seeking is very clear, the mental model is
Mhm.
very clear, the not finding in some cases, the finding more, like it has all of the kind of the dimensions that you talked about. But it's interesting. So you're saying in that moment you're looking for the Easter egg and the little kid doesn't find, like they lift up the cushion of the couch thinking they'll find it and there's nothing there. You're saying that the dopamine levels will actually drop in that moment?
Yes. Yes.
And so
They
what
will
is it
drop.
in what, because you would think if you forget about the neurotransmitters and what's going on in the brain, you just look at behavior. What of course happens is the seeking doesn't stop. Obviously, they seek even more. They immediately shift and like, okay, where do I need to go next? So there's something that's driving the seeking. But if the levels are dropping and if dopamine is that motivation, that goal directed motivational impulse in the brain. So maybe just unpack that. So how
Yeah,
does it play
so
into that situation?
those are all excellent questions, and it's an opportunity to speak about another piece of complexity here, and that is that dopamine is found in a number of different parts of the brain. It's not just in one isolated location, and its function in these different parts of the brain is different.
Hmm.
Um, so it's the same molecule, but the location is different. The receptors are different. The connections to the areas to which they're connected are different, and so the function is different. And so the dopamine that is part of the wanting circuit is found primarily in an area of the brain that we call the ventral striatum, which is a subcortical area that we know is rich in dopamine, and we know that if there's brain damage to that area, and these are, again, are studies in animals mostly that have tested this, the animals will not seek in the ways that we've been talking about,
Hmm.
but it doesn't affect their enjoyment of a reward. And so this has been very carefully studied in animals. If you um, they will not go and find, let's say that, the bananas are their favorite food. They can smell the banana. They know that it's 6 feet away. If they walk, they can get the banana. They will not go and get the banana, even though they can smell it. But if you put the banana in their mouth, they will enjoy it. And the way scientists have discovered that they enjoy it is they make certain sounds when they're enjoying it. They actually make a facial expression, and if you video them, you can see it. Um, and there are also other molecules that seem to be much more associated with pleasure that are activated, that are released. And the two major classes of molecules that are associated with pleasure in the brain are, interestingly, molecules that are opiates, but they're endogenous opiates, and molecules that are endogenous cannabinoids, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, um, which is found endogenously in the human brain. They're called endocannabinoids. And those molecules are active in response to the pleasure. Now, the signaling, the prediction errors that I was talking about are mediated uh, in a different but adjacent part of the brain that's also rich in dopamine. And the caudate nucleus is an area that is critically important for the prediction error signaling. There's also prediction area signaling in other areas of the brain, including the prefrontal cortex. And so these other dopamine related functions occur in different areas of the brain.
So when you're the kid, again, go back to the Easter egg example. You're looking for something, you're wanting something, and you're not getting it, or you're not finding it. Maybe even not finding it where you hope it will be or expect it to be. It's the prediction. So it's in the caudate, for example, that the levels would drop, but in the ventral striatum, which is in the reward network, that they still would. Is that true? Is that? Am I kind of tracking that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what would in that specific case, whether the dopamine levels would still. I mean, part of it, if the kid is still seeking, then you'd expect that the dopamine levels should be high in the ventral striatum. The prediction errors stuff that we're talking about are what we call phasic changes. They're really extremely short lived.
So it's very
Um,
dynamic up and down depending
very
on.
dynamic, up and down. They're like an evoked potential,
Mm,
in
mm.
an electrical signal that goes down and then up very, very quickly. And so these are all changes that you cannot see in the human brain because we don't have methods to look at changes on that time course non-invasively.
So what would you say to zoom out, again, with some of the memes like dopamine detox? I think a lot of what people are trying to get at and trying to understand, and more importantly, trying to intervene in their own inner lives, is these cycles that are essentially unfulfilling but become almost just like compulsive behavior. Again, like the doom scrolling is maybe the classical example. You're just inherently unfulfilling, and yet you do it compulsively and for long periods of time. So what do you think people really need to know? I mean, like one of the key takeaways is just that this is likely much, much more complex than we normally think. There's even with that one chemical and the one neurotransmitter or neuromodulator, even that is very complex because it depends clearly on which part of the brain you're looking at or which network you're looking at, and the time course is changing, so what it's doing from one moment to the next, and it's just incredibly complex. And so you can't just say that's the thing that we want to stop happening, because it's just way, way, way more complex than that. But what could we say? Like the disentangling of liking and wanting in my mind is one of the most helpful things about understanding how this is all being processed in the brain. But what would you say? Like, what would you want people to know that could be helpful for them in navigating some of these compulsive behaviors that we somehow get stuck in?
Yeah, I think that the knowledge that we're providing in this discussion can be potentially helpful, just in giving people a background. But I also think that kind of locking onto this in a excessively concrete way may not be that helpful. And so, with regard to, and we've clearly suggested that getting stuck in doom scrolling may involve dopamine initially, but it's got to be much more complicated than that. It's clearly involves some other things as well. And so, I think what's really important, I think the distinction between wanting and liking is really important. And I think um, that creating the kind of causes and conditions that really help us to appreciate the liking and to really tune in to become aware of the events, the stimuli that are associated with liking, can be enormously helpful. Some psychologists have called it savoring, where we can just really savor these positive moments. And I think that can really help get us unstuck from the loop of wanting. Uh, and, just reflecting on the background, well, this may be associated with these really interesting changes that are happening in my brain. But, any change in our experience is going to be associated with some differences in our brain. And the dopamine story, while interesting and at some very high level, there is truth to the fact that dopamine is primarily associated with wanting and with seeking. And to the extent that that kind of behavior is causing problems, we can do our best to change that. But one of the best ways to change it may be simply to focus more on liking.
Mhm. That's such an important point, and reminds me of some key insights from meditation, and certainly from my own practice. I'm sure you have your own experience of this, Richie, but I've noticed even with something like breath and mindful breathing, which was the first practice I learned and one that I still do to this day and find very helpful, that there are some practices in which the orientation is almost kind of to have a sort of a neutral stance. You're just sort of stepping back and you're orienting to awareness itself. And then you're kind of not worrying so much about whatever's happening within the field of awareness. You just kind of relate to whatever is happening. There's just kind of a neutral phenomena. And it's the orienting to awareness itself that is kind of the main focus or emphasis in that kind of practice. But there's another kind of practice, which is very, very different. And it's all about savoring. And in fact, you could do a practice like, breathing with awareness in one, or actually you could do it in many different ways, but just here to contrast, you could do it in the way I just mentioned, where it's really more about awareness and the breath is just like a support or an anchor to help you stay connected to it. But there's another way to do it where you can breathe as a process of savoring and you really tune into this felt sense of the nourishing, even healing quality of the breath. So because I've done this a lot, and I've done both forms of practice, but I've done a lot of the more, the savoring aspect. Even now, like as I do this, I have goosebumps. I can feel this chemical reaction in my body. Actually, my whole body right now is feeling this just because it's like you do anything, it just sort of, the moment you remember it, it just starts happening. But in this case, it's very interesting because you're just really just, and it's using almost the imagination at the beginning, and then at a certain point, it just elicits this visceral response where you just feel this pleasant energy, and you're just immersing yourself in this kind of healing energy of your own breath, and it's there every moment. But again, it's so different than just stepping back and being aware, which it does something very different. There's something even more helpful and profound about the orienting to awareness. But the key is that you can actually do that with anything, like loving kindness and compassion practices is sort of like you're savoring connection. Like you're
Hmm.
noticing something, you're first eliciting this feeling of connectedness. Like I can do this right now. Like we're talking. I can just say, "Okay, this is Richie. I love Richie." Like and again, immediately I feel that, and I'm like, "I do. I love you." And then you can immerse yourself in that, right? But it's a skill to just stay tuned in. It's like you're finding the frequency, and then habit energy is like kind of pulling you off course. But you just learn to just sort of keep it dialed in, and then you can get good at it. And then, you're around the Dalai Lama and he's like always in that frequency. Like he's never not in that frequency. And you can feel it when you're with him. It's like he's just radiating that because he is totally dialed into that frequency. But in a way, it's this quality of savoring. It's almost like a skill that you've learned and you can just deploy that in different ways. It could be eating an orange. It could be connecting with somebody else. It could be how you relate to it could be so many different things. But in a way, it feels to me like it is kind of the thing you're talking about here.
Yeah,
But it doesn't
I love your
there's no
description.
chasing in it, right? It's just the tuning into something that's
Exactly.
already there.
Exactly. I love that description. Yeah, you don't need to seek it because it's right there.
Yeah.
Um, so you can just let go of seeking completely and just tune right into the delicious nectar that is always there.
And I feel like, God, if just people just knew this, like it's meditation, there's so much chasing in our lives. And even meditation can be like, you can bring the chasing energy, the seeking energy into that, which almost never works out very well. But I'd be curious, maybe we can end this. There's so many more things we could talk about, but anything from your own practice, any kind of practical things that help you stay with the more savoring side of things and noticing the pull to get chasing and seeking and how to work with it?
Yeah. For me, appreciation and gratitude and also, the kind of practice that you and I do, Court, before we begin each of these Dharma Lab episodes of bodhicitta practice, really reflecting on how our actions can be of benefit to others. Um, there's just a sweetness associated with that, and really leaning in and connecting to that kind of sweet quality of connection for me is just heart opening and really just naturally allows the kind of wanting piece to subside on its own. So there's not like an active, you know pushing down that. But, um, just really leaning into and connecting to this sweetness. And then if you do find that the wanting is sort of rearing its head, to use kind of strategy that we've been taught by Mingyur Rinpoche, you can really try to become aware of that.
Mm.
Really just be aware of your wanting. And if you really stay aware of it and not get totally sucked into it, it's going to subside on its own.
That's beautiful. And I think there's some really helpful things from what you've shared, especially if we kind of zoom out to the detox idea. And a lot of this seems like the meme that's going around is almost like this abstinence. Like you just need to stop all stimulation, anything it's kind of like a kind of retreat from the world sort of mentality. But this reminds me of a word that is one of the most misunderstood words in Buddhist psychology and Buddhist meditation practice, which is there's a Tibetan term which is ngejung, which means nothing to anybody, but we translate it as renunciation, and it conjures up exactly like the detox mentality, as though it's all about letting go, like just distancing yourself from like whatever the bad stuff is or the stuff that's creating problems. But actually, what that term really means, what personally I think is actually a much better translation and both more accurate and more helpful, is that actually it's a reorientation, because it's more about what you're turning towards than what you're letting
Hmm.
go of or turning away from. And if you forget about that, it's not sustainable, because it's almost depleting. Like you have nothing that's bringing you joy or that's motivating you. And it's just kind of this lifeless, like you haven't replaced it with anything. You've just taken something away, but there's nothing there to sustain you. But this is all about orienting to something that's really nourishing and fulfilling and wholesome. And then the letting go actually is quite natural, because you're tasting an alternative that is just so obviously superior to the thing you let go of. So doom scrolling versus like what we're talking about now, connecting with a friend or just savoring something that's really meaningful, or like, of course that just feels better. So you just have that contrast in your mind versus I'm just going to let go of that and then what? And so I think maybe that's part of like maybe we
Yeah,
could,
that's great.
it's not like it is the liking and wanting, but it's not just the letting go of the endless wanting and craving, but it's perhaps even more about what you like and what you savor and what you
Hmm.
truly find fulfilling. So it feels like that you're giving
Yeah.
like the brain, analysis of that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Well, we could clearly talk a lot more about this. It feels like we just scratched the surface. We introduced a whole cast of characters with other neurotransmitters and other things, so maybe we can do a little more of this with other episodes. But as always, thank you so much, Richie. I learned a lot. This was super interesting, and I'm sure everybody came away with something hopefully helpful in their life. So thank you for everything you shared.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
All right. Well, stay tuned. I'm sure we'll have many more conversations like this. So if you're still with us, thank you for watching, and we will see you again soon. Take care.